Understood Betsy by Dorothy Canfield Fisher. Chapter 1. Aunt Harriet Has a Cough. When this story begins, Elizabeth Ann, who is the heroine of it, was a little girl of 9, who lived with her great-aunt Harriet in a medium-sized city in a medium-sized state in the middle of this country, and that's all you need to know about the place, for it's not the important thing in this story. And anyhow, you know all about it, because it was probably very much like the place you live in yourself. Elizabeth Ann's great-aunt Harriet was a widow who was not very rich or very poor, and she had one daughter, Frances, who gave piano lessons to little girls. They kept a girl whose name was Grace, and who had asthma dreadfully, and wasn't very much of a girl at all, being nearer 50 than 40. Aunt Harriet, who was very tender-hearted, kept her chiefly because she knew that Grace could never find any other job on account of her coughing, so you could hear her all over the house. So now you know the names of all the household, and this is how they looked. Aunt Harriet was very small and thin and old. Grace was very small and thin and middle-aged. Aunt Frances, for Elizabeth Ann called her aunt, although she was really, of course, a first cousin once removed, was small and thin, and if the light wasn't too strong, might be called young. And Elizabeth Ann was very small and thin and little, and yet they had all plenty to eat. They all had plenty to eat. I wonder what was the matter with them. It was certainly not because they were not good, for no womankind in all the world had kinder hearts than they. You have heard how Aunt Harriet kept Grace, in spite of the fact that she was a very depressing person, on account of her asthma, and when Elizabeth Ann's father and mother both died when she was a baby, although there were many other cousins and uncles and aunts in the family, these two women fairly rushed upon the little baby orphan, taking her home and surrounding her henceforth with the most loving devotion. They said to themselves that it was their manifest duty to save the dear little thing from the other relatives, who had no idea about how to bring up a sensitive, impressionable child, and they were sure, from the way Elizabeth Ann looked at 6 months, that she was going to be a sensitive, impressionable child. It is possible also that they were a little bored in their empty life in their rather forlorn little brick house in the medium-sized city. But they thought that they chiefly desired to save dear Edward's child from the other kin, especially from the Putney cousins, who had written down from their Vermont farm that they would be glad to take the little girl into their family. Aunt Harriet did not like the Vermont cousins. She used to say, "Anything but the Putneys." They were related only by marriage to her, and she had her own opinion of them as stiff-necked, cold-hearted, undemonstrative, and a hard set of New Englanders. "I boarded near them one summer when you were a baby, Frances, and I shall never forget the way they treated some children visiting there. Oh, no, I don't mean they abused them or beat them, but such lack of sympathy, such a starving of the child heart. No, I shall never forget it. The children had chores to do, as though they had been hired men." Aunt Harriet never meant to say any of this when Elizabeth Ann could hear, but the little girl's ears were as sharp as little girls' ears always are, and long before she was 9 she knew all about the opinion Aunt Harriet had of the Putneys. She did not know, to be sure, what chores were, but she knew from Aunt Harriet's voice that they were something dreadful. There was certainly neither coldness nor hardness in the way Aunt Harriet and Aunt Frances treated Elizabeth Ann. They had given themselves up to the new responsibility, especially Aunt Frances, who was conscientious about everything. As soon as the baby came there to live, Aunt Frances stopped reading novels and magazines and reread one book after another, which told her how to bring up children. She joined a mother's club, which met once a week. She took up a correspondence course from a school in Chicago, which taught mothercraft by mail. So you can see that by the time Elizabeth Ann was 9 years old, Aunt Frances must have known a great deal about how to bring up children. And Elizabeth Ann got the benefit of it all. Aunt Frances always said that she and the little girl were simply inseparable. She shared in all Elizabeth Ann's doings, in her thoughts, too. She felt she ought to share all the little girl's thoughts, because she was determined that she would thoroughly understand Elizabeth Ann down to the bottom of her little mind. Aunt Frances, down in the bottom of her own mind, thought that her mother had never really understood her, and she meant to do better by Elizabeth Ann. She also loved the little girl with all her heart, and longed, above everything in the world, to protect her from all harm, and to keep her happy and strong and well. Yet Elizabeth Ann was neither very strong nor well. As for her being happy, you can judge for yourself when you have read this story. She was small for her age, with a rather pale face and big dark eyes which had in them a frightened, wistful expression that went to Aunt Frances's tender heart and made her ache to take care of Elizabeth Ann better and better. Aunt Frances was afraid of a great many things herself, and she knew how to sympathize with timidity. She was always quick to reassure the little girl that with all her might and main, whenever there was anything to fear. When they were out walking, Aunt Frances took her out for a walk up one block and down another, every single day, no matter how tired the music lessons had made her. The aunt's eyes were always on the alert to avoid anything which might frighten Elizabeth Ann. If a big dog trotted by, Aunt Frances always said hastily, "There, there, dear, that's a nice doggy, I'm sure. I don't believe he ever bites little girls. Mercy, Elizabeth Ann, don't go near him. He's here, darling. Just get on the other side of Aunt Frances if he scares you so." By that time, Elizabeth Ann was always pretty well scared. Perhaps we'd better just turn the corner and walk in the other direction. If by any chance the dog went in that direction too, Aunt Frances became a prodigy of valiant protection, putting the shivering little girl behind her, threatening the animal with her umbrella, and saying in a trembling voice, "Go away, sir, go away!" Or if it thundered and lightninged, Aunt Frances always dropped everything she might be doing, and held Elizabeth Ann tightly in her arms until it was all over. And at night, Elizabeth Ann did not sleep very well. When the little girl woke up screaming with a bad dream, it was always dear Aunt Frances who came to her bedside, a warm wrapper over her nightgown so that she need not hurry back to her own room, a candle lighting up her face, her tired, kind face. She took the little girl into her thin arms and held her close against her thin breast. "Tell Aunt Frances all about your naughty dream, darling," she would murmur, "so's to get it off your mind." She had read in her book that you can tell a great deal about children's inner lives by analyzing their dreams, and besides, if she did not urge Elizabeth Ann to tell it, she was afraid the sensitive, nervous little thing would lie awake and brood over it. This was the phrase she always used the next day to her mother when Aunt Harriet exclaimed about her paleness and the dark rings under her eyes. So she listened patiently while the little girl told her all about the fearful dreams she had, the great dogs with huge red mouths that ran after her, the Indians who scalped her, her schoolhouse on fire so that she had to jump from a third-story window and was all broken to bits. Once in a while Elizabeth Ann got so interested in all this that she went on and made up more awful things even than she had dreamed, and told long stories which showed her to be a child of great imagination. These dreams and continuations of dreams Aunt Frances wrote down the first thing the next morning, and tried her best to puzzle out from them exactly what kind of little girl Elizabeth Ann was. There was one dream, however, that even conscientious Aunt Frances never tried to analyze, because it was too sad. Elizabeth Ann dreamed sometimes that she was dead and lay in a little white coffin with white roses over her. Oh, that made Aunt Frances cry, and so did Elizabeth Ann. It was very touching. Then, after a long, long time of talk and tears and sobs and hugs, the little girl would begin to get drowsy, and Aunt Frances would rock her to sleep in her arms and lay her down ever so quietly, and slip away to try to get a little nap herself before it was time to get up. At 9:15 every weekday morning, Aunt Frances dropped whatever else she was doing, took Elizabeth Ann's little thin hand protectingly in hers, and led her through the busy streets to the big brick school building where the little girl had always gone to school. It was 4 stories high, and when all the classes were in session there were 600 children under that one roof. You can imagine, perhaps, the noise there was on the playground just before school. Elizabeth Ann shrank from it with all her soul, and clung more tightly than ever to Aunt Frances's hands as she was led along through the crowded, shrieking masses of children. Oh, how glad she was that she had Aunt Frances there to take care of her, though as a matter of fact nobody noticed the little thin girl at all, and her own classmates would hardly have known whether she came to school or not. Aunt Frances took her safely through the ordeal of the playground, then up the long, broad stairs, and pigeonholed her carefully in her own schoolroom. She was in the 3rd grade, 3A, you understand, which is almost the 4th. Then at noon, Aunt Frances was waiting there, a patient, never-failing figure, to walk home with her little charge, and in the afternoon the same thing happened over again. On the way to and from school, they talked about what had happened in the class. Aunt Frances believed in sympathizing with the child's life, so she always asked about every little thing, and remembered to inquire about the continuation of every episode, and sympathized with all her heart over the failure in mental arithmetic, and triumphed over Elizabeth Ann's beating the Schmidt girl in spelling, and was indignant over the teachers having pets. Sometimes, in telling over some very dreadful failure or disappointment, Elizabeth Ann would get so wrought up that she would cry. This always brought the ready tears to Aunt Frances's kind eyes, and with many soothing words and nervous, tremulous caresses, she tried to make life easier for poor little Elizabeth Ann. The days when they had cried, neither of them could eat much luncheon. After school and on Saturdays, there was always the daily walk, and there were lessons, all kinds of lessons. Piano lessons, of course, and nature study lessons out of an excellent book Aunt Frances had bought, and painting lessons, and sewing lessons, and even a little French, although Aunt Frances was not very sure about her pronunciation. She wanted to give the little girl every possible advantage, you see. They were really inseparable. Elizabeth Ann once said to some ladies calling on her aunts that whenever anything happened in school, the first thing she thought of was what Aunt Frances would think of it. "Why is that?" they asked, looking at Aunt Frances, who was blushing with pleasure. "Oh, she is so interested in my schoolwork, and she understands me," said Elizabeth Ann, repeating the phrases she had heard so often. Aunt Frances's eyes filled with happy tears. She called Elizabeth Ann to her, and kissed her, and gave her as big a hug as her thin arms could manage. Elizabeth Ann was growing tall very fast. One of the visiting ladies said before long she would be as big as her auntie, and a troublesome young lady. Aunt Frances said, "I have had her from the time she was a little baby, and there has scarcely been an hour she has been out of my sight. I'll always have her confidence. You'll always tell Aunt Frances everything, won't you, darling?" Elizabeth Ann resolved to do this always, even if, as now, she sometimes didn't have much to tell and had to invent something. Aunt Frances went on to the callers. "But I do wish she weren't so thin and pale and nervous. I suppose the exciting modern life is bad for children. I try to see that she has plenty of fresh air. I go out with her for a walk every single day, but we have taken all the walks around here so often that we're rather tired of them. It's often hard to know how to get her out enough. I think I'll have to get the doctor to come and see her, and perhaps give her a tonic." To Elizabeth Ann she added hastily, "Now, don't go getting notions in your head, darling. Aunt Frances doesn't think there's anything very much the matter with you. You'll be all right again soon if you just take the doctor's medicine nicely.